As a re-recording engineer to somebody who has shot a low-budget film, the advice that I would give would be to prepare as much as you can before you enter the mix, whether it's labeling tracks, organizing the sound effects and the dialogue and the music. If you prepare that to the fullest of your capabilities and extent, it'll make my job a lot easier. It'll allow me to be much more flexible, allow me to be more creative, and spend less time editorially cleaning stuff up. It'll be much better to be prepared. Some of the standards that I'm looking for when people bring audio to me, it usually should be in a Pro Tools session. It should have some sort of sound editorial work done to it, whether it's a sound editor who has prepared the dialogue tracks, cut them, edit them together, whether it's a music editor who has prepared some music for me, or somebody who's designed sound effects. Some of that should have already been prepared and taken care of and edited together and placed properly within the timeline. I'm looking for that type of stuff that would really benefit their time, on the mixing stage with me. Some of the most common problems that I see on the stage are unorganized, unprepared tracks. If a sound editor if it's somebody that I've not worked with before, usually we need to have some sort of dialogue where they will prepare the tracks in a way that works best for me. Sometimes editors will flesh out the dialogue to sometimes like 24 tracks, and I prefer to have stuff more condensed to like 16 or 8 tracks, and that way it's easier for me to navigate. Sometimes there's, dialogue that's off mic or has some, ticks and pops and clicks and stuff like that. I'd like that to be prepared before it gets to the mix. Some of the problems then that I see in the low budget or no budget films is that they didn't really care for sound, either whether it was on the production or in the cutting room. So a lot of times what happens is, whether you're in Premiere or Final Cut, sometimes they marry the picture and the audio together, and it loses all of the metadata that the sound recordist had on set. And what happens is, now when I go back and I want to find lavs or different takes, it becomes a really difficult task to do that, because now I have no link between the picture and the audio. It's just kind of what they gave us is what we have to use. And if somebody takes the care and thought to save that metadata or save that connection back to the original raw tracks, then it makes my job a lot easier to find the tracks that I need to make the soundtrack sound correct. My approach to sound mixing is to have the track sound as natural as possible. I'm mainly a dialogue and music re-recording mixer, so it's my job to take all the elements that were recorded on set and make them sound full. A lot of times, some of the pitfalls that people fall into is that they try and clean up the sound too much, and what that does is it takes the viewer out of the film. My approach to it more is that I leave as much as possible to make it sound realistic and really help the actor's performance and really draw the viewer in, and whether that's with the dialogue and kind of leaving it a little bit on the rougher side, or with the music to kind of envelop the viewer to give them some sort of emotional connection to the film. Some of the steps that I take to accomplish the mix would be to normally sit down with the filmmaker. We watch it together. We kind of go over the workflow. We kind of understand what he or she is expecting from the sound. We watch the film and highlight certain areas that they deem to be very important for sound. Maybe they've written into the script. And then once that happens, I receive the material from the editor or the director. And then if this is just me working on it, then I would go and clean up the dialogue, edit the dialogue, replace any necessary dialogue. Then I would kind of edit the backgrounds and kind of bring to life some of the environments that the characters are in. If there's any sort of Foley that needs to be taken care of, I would either try and cut that from a sound library or any sort of like hard effects. Add those in as well, and then usually the composer brings in the final music, whether it's stems or just regular stereo tracks, and then I mix that in as well. It's kind of, when you're working by yourself, you kind of have to wear a lot of hats. I usually like to edit everything first to kind of place it where it needs to be, make sure I'm choosing the right sound for the right environment at the right time. And then once all that's done, then I have the ability to kind of follow the picture and the story. It's really my job, and my perspective on it is that I'm only there to enhance the story. And it's tough on low budgets because you have a lot of constraints, because maybe you're not making the movie that you wanted to make because of money or locations or actors or something like that. So you really have to rely on a good story. And so if sound can be that much better, it can really help you tell the story that you want to, whether it's with the music or whether it's with the dialogue, and making sure that you hear every word, or you get nuanced when you need to, or you get loud when you need to, whether it's with sound effects or music or what have you. Usually on low budget films, although not so much recently, how I handle dialogue tracks would be to do an initial pass on cleaning it up and editing them together. So to me, it doesn't matter if they're that noisy, because if it's a realistic interpretation of the environment, then I kind of want them to feel real and a little rough around the edges. I'm not part of the group of people who feel like it has to be pristine. A lot of movies that I've worked on in New York are a lot of walk and talks, and they don't have as many explosions, and they're not, in caves under the sea and stuff like that. It's very much in and around New York, and or upstate. So creating environments is a very big part of that. But keeping the dialogue real and full and rich, I really like that, and I don't like to clean it up so much. It doesn't need to be crystal clean, and these imperfections kind of help tell the story, or it's kind of how the director intended it to be. So especially with the low budget ones, I try and create as much real feeling as I possibly can. Sometimes you have to use these cleanups, or sometimes you have to replace dialogue because either the production mixer wasn't able to get it, or they just used a camera mic, or there's some sort of other technical problem. Sometimes we have to replace the dialogue. But yeah, generally I try and keep the dialogue tight up front, but real at the same time too. I don't apply a lot of processing. I do a general leveling, mild compression, but I try and level and use colorful EQ as possible to make it sound like it was in the space. I'm a big reverb guy. I use a lot of really cool, interesting reverbs, but just trying to preserve what was captured on set to help tell the story. So that's how my perspective on the dialogue. How I generally handle ADR, in, let's say, in the middle of a scene. It really depends on the scene. If it's a very quiet scene, it's a lot harder to do because you're dealing with actors who are kind of out of character at that point. They have to go and re-record their voice, and it's a lot harder to do. It's a lot harder to be in character in an ADR stage as opposed to being on set when you have other actors around and the director, you have lights on you. It's a definitely different environment, and they usually give a different performance. So the performance aspect of it is always the hardest thing to match. As far as technically as far as matching it, it's a combination of EQ and a little bit of reverb. I actually find that compression is a huge part of that as well, because on set you have these lav microphones that generally are very compressed coming into the recorder, and that's just a part of how the microphone reacts. And so when you're in the ADR stage, it's a very clean path of audio, and what really stands out for ADR a lot of the time, technically, is it's very bright and it feels very in your face, whereas stuff that's recorded on set is a bit muffled and a bit rougher. So use a couple different forms of compression to really push the voice forward and roll off some of that brightness and high end and cleanliness that you get in an ADR stage, and sometimes that works. But sometimes if you're in, if you have loop group and you have a lot of other, voices around, then it's a lot easier to hide the ADR. If it's in, a very noisy scene, a lot of sound effects, it's a lot easier to do. But generally, I try and mimic the sound of a lav, because a lot of the times now in productions, especially low-budget productions, the lav is what's used a lot. So mimicking that will really help ADR fit in the middle of a scene. To clean up ADR or to fit ADR in a scene where the boom is primarily used, it's based on the scene. So if it's in a room like we're in right now, maybe adding a short slap kind of reverb on the voice to make it fit a little bit nicer. Again, rolling off a little bit of that high end to make it fit in the scene a little bit more. But it's very based on the scene that you're in, the emotional content that you want to get across with the line. Is it an added line? Is it a replaced line? Sometimes if you're replacing just for technical reasons, then you can steal bits and pieces of the actual production to make it sound and fit more naturally. But if you're actually replacing the line for something else, for content, then it's a little bit harder to do. But yeah, generally, if I'm using a boom, a little slap on it will make it sound a little bit more natural. But for the lav, I try and use a little bit more compression to push it through the mix and make it sound more comparable to the lavs.